here, and there's Stephanie. She's unlocking doors. So I think we're all here and all ready to go. If you guys don't mind, would ask if you would just do a brief introduction. Company, how long you've been doing this, and go from there. Or if Floyd, if you'd like to introduce, that'd be great.
Okay. So yes, Mayor, we're pleased to have the opportunity today for the Mayor and Council to discuss options for infrastructure funding. What we're bringing today is our consultant on possible policy and moving forward with a municipal utility district. And so the question is, why a municipal utility district and why now? So historically, Amarillo struggled with support for infrastructure growth, and we've looked at this from many angles over my career here. But the challenge is that those infrastructure projects must compete with the limited city funding, whether that's general fund, enterprise funds, or others. So there are also challenges related to legislative issues related to subdivision, annexation, and those. Brings it to being an issue that needs to be looked at now. But the future of Amarillo's growth is a component of what we're talking about. And this is a policy discussion. We're talking about policy discussions related to the Development Policy Manual, related to how we look forward to that. And obviously, being at that high level of discussion, it needs to be something with council's update and approval to look at going forward. But what we're looking for, it would be an opportunity to find a dedicated funding source for development and how that would look forward in the future such that it's not competing with other needs. And y'all have been through the budgets to understand the competing needs within the existing funding, so we don't need to get into that. But how do we move development forward consistently over time? And so we've been through many discussions. Some of you have served on citizens committees, and some of you are newer at this. And as we look at this, that's why now? Because we've had a development community bring this to us in multiple times, asking the question, is this an option that we would be willing to look at for certain developments around the city? So it's ripe from that perspective that our development community is looking at this. What we brought to you today is our consultant looking at it. We're proud of Steve Robinson and Leah Vinson. These are, I'll let them introduce themselves with their qualifications better, but that's where we're at, and that's the introduction that I have for you to start this meeting. So Steve, Leah, will you all take it from there?
Certainly. Mayor, Council, it's a pleasure to be here. My name is Steve Robinson. I'm a partner at Allen Boone Humphreys Robinson. We're a 21-year law firm, but in this industry, I guess I'm in my 34th year of doing this, and really our lineage goes back really more than 60 years in this this business. We have offices in Houston, Austin, and Dallas. I run the Dallas office. My partner, Leah Vinson, is in the Houston office. Today, we're about 48 lawyers, 165 total personnel, and this is exclusively what we do. We work with cities, counties, and developers on the use of special districts to provide public infrastructure for land development. We do have a very active legislative practice in this area, so most of the laws in this area are things, and the regulatory environment are things that we have worked on for a very, very long time. We have worked through, and really today work throughout the state. I want to make it clear, we are here as your lawyers. We are here to have a full discussion about how these are used, why they're used, what are your decision points, et cetera. In addition to kind of today doing a 101. So we're grateful for the opportunity to be here and represent the city and hopefully to try to demystify what these vehicles are. Leah, if you want to add anything else.
Well, I don't have a whole lot to add, but it's always great to be back in West Texas, and we have a presentation that we've prepared in advance. We'll walk our way through that, but we welcome any questions or discussion throughout, and then, of course, we'll stick around for questions at the end. We've really appreciated the time of your staff. The city staff has put a lot of time into making sure that we have the information we need to help provide you with guidance, and we're glad to get started.
All right.
So just to map out a few goals here, we're pretty task-oriented. We need to get a kind of a 101 education on what a MUD is, maybe a couple of the other instruments that could be available. And then we need to see, before we go down this road, does this council want to direct a policy change that would allow for this type of growth? Is it going to be helpful knowing that we are being petitioned is the wrong word, but we're being proposed by a developer of, hey, we would like to do this, and the fact of it is that the developer can do it with or without us. In the way in which they grow, is this a way that we can grow together so we improve on city services, we improve on our tax base, so on and so forth. So, Steve, I've got you. Is it Leah or Aaliyah?
Aaliyah.
Aaliyah. How do you spell that?
It's Alia.
Okay, we'll get you right here then. And so let me ask you guys, if you don't mind, my overall goal here in being in a few conversations with you, also being in conversations with developers and seeing the need, and I have 25 years of doing business with my city. So I understand how the answer can be sometimes of, we don't have the money. So the answer is no. Unless you want us to raise taxes and people are going to give us more, then we can't pay for that, regardless of the ROI, right? So in trying to solve that problem of why are we here, we are trying to solve the problem of how do we grow, annex people voluntarily, and still tell them we're not going to pay for all of your infrastructure on the front end. We cannot go put $30 million out of pocket on a $100 million development where there's not one house that's sold and not one, user who needs a water meter.
Right.
However, this could provide a way that $100 million investment could be paid with the developer, and the annexation could be negotiated in so that they become part of the city and they become part of our tax base, and user fees do apply, and that they're reimbursed.
Yeah.
And so
that's that. And we will go through all of those issues and kind of how we've gotten here and kind of why we do these, both kind of the nuts and bolts as well as the why, answering, and then kind of get to more of the policy considerations for the city about how to approach if you are going to approach.
So with the why is a little bit of the how, right? So how do we do this? Well, we could choose to go and negotiate with a developer, and whatever we agree to with him or that entity is your new policy because you've done it. Or we could choose to allow staff to negotiate with the developer, work on that with consultants and legal to legal. Council could work on their own policy initiative based on what we think would be a good fit while all that's going on. We're going to learn, and then we're going to have something where it could be a take it or leave it. So if you don't get to a negotiation with that developer, we don't want it to die. We don't want to say, well, we don't do MUDs here. Right. We would like to have something where, okay, even if they choose not to do business with us and become part of the city, can we put forward a policy initiative that allows for growth? And the next developer may say, this is great. I'm all good. Right. And so that's my goal here today, if that makes sense.
Super. Well, let's get going, and we'll try to cover all the things that you're doing. So, high level, what are we talking about? A municipal utility district, and kind of we'll use the term MUD. There are other special districts that are used around the state that are very similar. You'll hear the term water control and improvement district or freshwater supply districts. There was a time when those had a lot of distinctions. Those have gone away by and large. I may use the term special district, or I may use the term mud. But what I am talking about is a political subdivision with the ability to levy a property tax to finance a limited number of public facilities: water, sewer, drainage, and roads. There are certain counties around the state where those districts can finance parks and recreational facilities. You are not in one of those counties, and so they do have the ability to operate those facilities, but they don't have the ability to finance them. They are a limited, defined boundaries, generally driven by a land developer's request to create a district over a defined area. They are a way to provide municipal infrastructure and services where those don't currently exist, and the city either does not want to take the development risk of extending without any houses there yet, or is unable to afford to provide those and extend those facilities. I want to talk a little bit about kind of just the general background. This concept of utilizing a property tax to finance public infrastructure actually goes back to the Rio Grande Valley and the irrigation districts of the early 1900s, where all of the farmers got together and said, hey, we're going to create an irrigation district. It's going to have 10,000 acres. We need to draw water out of the Rio Grande. We're going to build a canal system, et cetera, and we're going to levy a tax over all of this area where all the farms are to help pay each farmer pay their pro rata share. In the early 1960s, that concept was picked up primarily in Houston, where growth began to occur on an exponential basis because of the energy boom, and the city of Houston had no capability of extending the utilities and keeping up with demand. There was kind of an agreed upon peace between the city of Houston and the developers. It went about like this: if you will build to our standards, if you will allow us to review your plans and specifications for water, sewer, drainage, and roads, we will allow you to create a municipal utility district and use private capital to build the public infrastructure. And if you perform, you can utilize the district as a means to get reimbursed. But the developer is going to take development risk. You will keep your finger on the trigger for the timing of when you deploy capital to create additional public infrastructure. So the timing of growth is drives the need for infrastructure, and instead of a city building a big water line out and hoping the developers are deploying their capital to build the streets and the internal infrastructure, we're going to say, no, you make that decision, you take the risk. The developer should take that development risk. And it is the way in which Houston was able to very rapidly grow to meet. If you think about Houston today, a city of about 2.2 million and an 8 million MSA, well, guess where all of those other outside of the 2.2, the vast majority were in these districts that were able to provide that public infrastructure. But that then began, spreading throughout the state, initially to Central Texas, then to San Antonio, and now into the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Why we do this, it really has two components. One is, who should take development risk? Meaning, should that be the municipality that is going to extend out into undeveloped areas, hoping that the developer will show up and create the taxable value, or should we allow a mechanism that allows the development community to take that development risk on that growth? But the second piece, and maybe the less obvious piece, is that this is a much more efficient a way to provide affordable or attainable mortgages. If you think about a traditional land developer who builds within a city, you have one point in which you have a revenue event, and that is when you sell a lot, you get your land back, your development cost, your profit, but also all of your public infrastructure. And so you have to gross up that lot price and embed that into that lot price. That ends up being in the mortgage. When we have a district, we have two revenue events, because that first revenue event is when you sell the lot. The second revenue event is when you get reimbursed for all the public infrastructure that was not included in the lot price. Because of that, you're able, the general metric right now may not be in this market, but in North Texas, 50-foot lot, about $1,500 per front foot in public infrastructure, or $75,000 per lot. That cost can either go into a mortgage or it can be paid by the municipal utility district's tax. And what happens is, if you add it, far fewer people can attain that mortgage when you add those costs, particularly when you look at the lot prices nationwide are typically between 18 and 22% of the ultimate home price. So there is a way to create more attainable housing, and we'll talk about that later today in an example. So,
Steve,
yes.
do you mind to go ahead and just hit a couple of the definitions?
Sure.
So that we're familiar as we talk through it. Frontage fees, different developer fees, rough proportionality. Do you mind hitting just a few of those key items that we used to look to, right?
Yeah.
We used to say to our developers, essentially, like, you assess a fee, and that will come to us, or they had a few other ways of doing that. But if you'll bring us up to speed on a few definitions, if you would.
Yeah, so what we're talking about, municipal utility district, is that district. They're going to levy an ad valorem or property tax with two components. Your options for providing the public infrastructure, or the city extends all of those, hoping that comes back. You impose an impact fee in that area to recoup some or all of those costs. When I talked about a frontage foot, I meant if you had a 50-foot wide lot per frontage foot, our average cost now in the North Texas market is somewhere between $1,500 and $2,000 per frontage foot. So between $75,000 and $100,000 of public infrastructure, water, sewer, drainage, and roads to develop that lot. Those are the metrics that we're talking about.
Steve,
yes.
Can I weigh in just for clarity, Mayor? So we don't currently in this manual have a reimbursement policy other than front foot for water and sewer that is minimal.
Well, and frontage fees.
So when he's talking about frontage fees, so just for y'all's clarity is we don't have that. So that is another mechanism. There are mechanisms other than a MUD where you can go in and have this reimbursement policy. We don't have an ordinance for an impact fee internal. And so some of the things that you're talking about is just for clarity is where we're at versus what a MUD can option.
And frontage fees not being applied to residential.
Yeah.
So to make that delineation there, only on a commercial project.
Got it.
Would you have a frontage fee, incurred cost, and then
So you don't have a reimbursement component for streets and drainage at all?
don't on residential. On the commercial, you do if you had a mainline extension. Impact fees are not here. I think
Correct.
probably debated for a while, and Definitely, I'd say the building community didn't want those.
Correct.
So outlining a little bit of the reason why a MUD may be a good idea.
Yeah.
So-
And we'll if we can, we'll keep plowing through some of this because I think we'll answer all of those questions. So just a little bit overview. This is not a small market. There are over 2,151 active special districts. Millions of people in Texas live in these. Last year, the market, municipal utility district bond market was about $3.1 billion. That's the amount of public infrastructure they finance as an industry in Texas last year. The majority of the land is outside city limits. But there are districts that are in city around the state also, and these are very often used for our large scale development. Usually not used because of transaction costs. Not used on a 50-acre or a 30-acre infill. These are typically used for your tracts of 150 acres or more, your large-scale, more planned communities. So what do? They construct and operate water, sewer, and drainage. They construct public roads. And all of those have to be competitively bid, publicly bid. They construct and operate parks and recreational facilities. Here, you could operate them. You cannot finance them. We finance through a reimbursement basis, and this is a really critical part of the Texas system, and it's different than the system around the country for other special districts. The Texas system, since 1989, has been solely a reimbursement-based system. The developer has to spend all the money to build all the public infrastructure up front to meet the city's standards, subject to city review of all the plans, et cetera. The developer cannot get reimbursed for those facilities until they meet certain financial criteria regulated by the TCEQ. So the important part of that are twofold. One, the developer takes all development risk. The city does not take development risk. Secondly, the reimbursement is by the MUD with MUD-supported taxes, not city revenues or city-supported taxes. And three, because it's a reimbursement basis and you have to be feasible pursuant to the TCEQ rules, Texas Commission on Environmental Quality rules, to be eligible to be reimbursed, the districts have to be able to show that they can pay all of their debt for the life of the bonds with the current value on the ground at a reasonable tax rate. The result is, since 1989, we have had a 0% default rate, not a single. In all 2,100 and plus districts since 1989, there has never been a default on a special district bond because we are very highly regulated to make sure that we don't issue debt up front. We can provide supplemental services. These are typically in the ETJ or in the unincorporated area by contract for firefighting, trash, police. That it will be one of the decisions that we will want to talk about, is whether or not in the ETJ you want them to pay for those services. They also have the authority to implement those by entering into contracts, taxing. They have limited eminent domain rights for off-sites that are needed. They can operate, they can charge fees. So why do we do this? First and foremost, this is a means for new growth to pay for itself, meaning we can isolate the cost of the public infrastructure and the services that need to be provided to promote land development that is adjacent to the city, and you can say, Your MUD will pay for all the water, sewer, drainage, roads. You will charge fees. We can provide firefighting and police services on a fee-for-services basis, and we're going to isolate those, and they are going to be paid for in the MUD. So you can, on a self-supporting basis, obligate that MUD by contract to provide those facilities and services and have that district, the developer is going to pay for them up front. They're going to get reimbursed by the district, but that new growth is not going to be subsidized by existing taxpayers. Rooftops in general, unless you have very expensive houses, are almost impossible to support full municipal services. You're going to get the sales tax from growth in your ETJ no matter what. They're going to still shop in your city. The property tax component, unless you're building in most cities around Texas, $800, $900 million houses, are not going to be supported. You're not going to support those full municipal services with pure rooftops. And so this, as a way to think about it, is really a long-term growth mechanism, meaning we will allow the project to develop subject to our rules. We will isolate all those costs, make sure they are self-supporting, and then over time, after it has developed, we will annex it in to the city after it has paid for its new growth. And we are not going to ask our existing taxpayers to take development risk or to subsidize, because the rooftops simply can't pay for those services.
Steve, can I ask a question real quick?
Sure.
So there is an annexation agreement tied to this that when it becomes self-sustaining,
That's correct.
We've already agreed that we will take it.
That's correct. You would typically agree that you have the right to take it.
Okay, so we don't have to exercise it, but it is there if we want it, if it's self-sustaining.
And just a quick on that, the Texas legislature removed the unilateral right of annexation for the city in 2019, but they also included that bill what are called strategic partnership agreements. Strategic partnership agreements are an agreement between the city and a MUD, which we would contemplate and have contemplated here, that provide the terms and conditions for eventual annexation of the area when you meet the conditions in that agreement. The important part of that is, in the absence of a strategic partnership agreement, the city would be unable to annex an area in your ETJ without holding an election in that area. With a strategic partnership agreement, you are from day one telling every resident, you are subject to a strategic partnership agreement. You will be annexed, or at least the city has the right to annex. And in the future, as the MUD pays down its debt and it's financially viable for the city to annex, we have the right, under the terms and conditions of the strategic partnership agreement, to annex you. The other related benefit is the strategic partnership agreement gives you the ability to do a limited purpose annexation of any commercial property. So if they did some neighborhood commercial in a MUD, a grocery store, dry cleaners, etc., if you limited purpose annex those areas, you can levy your sales tax even though it's in your ETJ in the future. And that's all pursuant to the strategic partnership agreement.
Okay.
So you talked about sales tax. How does that play in effect whenever, say there's a CAD in place with your counties already that are maximizing that full 2%?
Yeah.
How do you go about that?
Yeah. So the city, the real question is, sales taxes are first come, first serve, meaning whoever's there first gets that sales taxes. And so when you annex, the real question is what's available. Your 1 penny of sales tax is what is typically available. If you have a county assistance district that has levied a 2 penny tax, they are the first ones there. And that 2 penny, in the absence of an agreement with the the CAD would remain in place. So.
Yeah, and Steve, I would just add, same thing with emergency services districts,
Yes.
right? So if you have ESDs that have already gone in and taken the sales tax that's available, then you don't have any further ability. We really are capped out at that 2 cents, and if someone's already shown up and taken it, then there isn't the possibility of doing the limited purpose and imposing your sales tax. But that's part of the evaluation. But the strategic partnership agreement, sales tax is one component of how it can be valuable, but really for a city in today's legislative climate, the primary value is the ability to annex that property at your option, which otherwise does not exist.
Yeah, and I'll be more direct. The areas in the ETJs that are developed without a strategic partnership, we have never, since the passage of in 2019, had an election passed in an ETJ to annex in. We don't expect those elections will pass. And so it really is the path for ETJ growth that is guaranteed that you have the right to annex.
So to go a little deeper on what he's talking about, you would negotiate up front a fee for service for police and fire.
Correct.
In those areas?
Correct. So our typical agreements, you would have a development agreement that relates to what you're going to build, a strategic partnership agreement that provides for the annexation, an agreement related to utilities to provide what costs are going to have to be paid for, and how service is going to be provided to them, wholesale, retail, et cetera, and then a services agreement. So those services that the city decides they want to provide in the ETJ can be provided to them on a fee-for-services basis. Usually you would do a cost for service analysis. What's it cost us to provide fire per house a month? We're going to charge you $21.50 per month. It's going to be put onto your water bill, and you're going to collect that for fire. What does it cost to provide police? I'm just throwing out numbers, obviously.
Right.
What does it cost to provide police? And we're willing to provide those. There are the ability to negotiate future expansion of physical facilities also, like new fire station sites, new fire facilities, and the districts do have the ability with a fire plan to actually finance and pay for those.
Do you have examples around the state where, let's say you had a taxing district that already had the sales tax? How does that function logistically if you have a county that said, well, we're not interested in a shared cost? Do you exclude services and annex those? Are you required to provide service upon annexation? How does that work?
Yeah, so upon full purpose annexation, the city has the duty to provide full municipal services at the same level that they provide around the city. We have it in the ETJ, it's all across the board. Cities who just say, y'all just deal with the county or an ESD, do your own trash. We don't want anything to do with it, to we want that area in the ESD to feel very much like it's still part of the city or in the mud. And so we want city fire, city police, city trash from day one. You're just going to pay for it. And we're not asking our resident taxpayers, since they're not paying your property tax, our resident taxpayers to pay for that.
Describe, Steve, if you would, the interim, because let's take a 3,000 home development,
right,
and you're going to turn out, let's say 400 or 500 houses at most per year. So 5-6 years of growth. Are these mud homes unserved, just like anything in the county, or I shouldn't say unserved. Are they served by county services until the annexation upon completion? Is that how that works?
It could, more often than not, where we have very capable city municipal services. Mm-hmm. There is a desire, as long as you're not asking your existing taxpayers to subsidize, and they will pay, that the city provides on a fee-for-services basis.
To the mud.
And you could pick and choose. You can say, we're fine with the county providing the sheriff, providing, and we don't want to provide police, but we want to provide fire.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, but this is a kind of a menu option for you to negotiate.
It's a cafeteria plan.
A cafeteria.
They get
Yeah.
to choose what they want. So are the builders and developers in the district subject to the municipal codes and ordinances, building codes and ordinances
Yeah, so-
as they develop?
Yeah, so really good question. That's part of, they are not in the city, so your ordinances don't apply by a matter of law. What really happens is we negotiate a development agreement, and contractually, we agree on what, codes they have to apply, what they're going to have to comply with by contract. All of, platting automatically applies by law. Review of all the infrastructure plans, all applies by law. The real question is, land use, all your design standards, all of those things that are only apply because you're in a municipality by ordinance. Which of those do you want to apply here? And it could be all of them. It could be a limited set. It could be certain, because, negotiated, almost like a PUD ordinance. And that's part of that development agreement process, because they are in your ETJ. The ordinance doesn't apply, but by contract, we're going to agree what the rules of the game are.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
And we'll get you back on track here on the presentation.
Sure.
But density plays a role.
Correct.
So these are not typically a desire to have a 1-2 acre tract with a bar ditch, no curb and gutter, and like no yards, no fencing.
Right.
So these are very typical in-town, residential developments. They're going to have curb and gutter. They're going to have smaller streets. They're going to have smaller lots. Density is what the developer's going after. So I just want council to keep in mind, we're not trying to figure out how to annex in, 2 to 5 acre lots inside of the city, and they don't follow the same code standards, even flood studies, right? So
Right.
Drainage, all of that stuff comes into play. This is a desire to be able to work with a developer on a very in-town residential style, more dense
Right.
development.
And obviously, highly amenitized as part of, getting agreement on what, what type of amenities you're going to have. These districts guarantee that you will have high-quality infrastructure. They must meet all of your standards and be reviewed by the city. We can't finance anything that the city didn't review and approve before we went and built it in a district. They're subject to TCEQ rules on infrastructure quality. These are locally controlled. You will initially have a board that's appointed either by the TCEQ or the legislature, but eventually will be elected from residents within that area. It does allow us to access tax-exempt financing, which is part of the efficiency here, and why we're able to deliver that infrastructure less expensively than building it into a mortgage. And it does allow us to produce more attainable housing by pulling out from that mortgage those infrastructure costs.
Steve, can you touch on what is over here? What is the TCQ's role in all this? You keep mentioning TCQ.
Sure.
Why are they involved?
Yeah, great. And it's later, but we'll hit on it quickly. The TCQ is the regulatory entity that both creates the districts, but also has regulatory control. They have a set of rules that largely have been in place since 1989, unchanged, that go into all of the issues of the terms and conditions upon which the developer has to comply with in order to issue bonds. And so, the TCQ creates the vast majority of the districts through an application process. They have a review process for any bonds that are issued. We cannot sell bonds unless we submit an application to them and show that we have met all their rules. The district has met all their rules, that the financing is financially viable. And so they are the supervisory agency. And really what has been traded here is a very highly regulated environment for creating a lot of certainty that we're not going to have kind of defaults, et cetera, in this market. This really is just a sample of what happens to the ultimate home prices, et cetera, in a MUD and not in a MUD. These are some older numbers, but they were provided at a legislative hearing by one of the largest land developers in the United States, Newland Communities. But it basically just shows you that if you pull the public infrastructure cost out by having a MUD versus not having a MUD, you're able to produce much more attainable housing. And really in the state of Texas today, and the comptroller just issued a 27-page report on the affordability crisis that we have in Texas now. It really makes a huge difference in who can qualify for a mortgage, depending on whether you have one of these districts or you don't have one of these districts. And happy to go back, but there's probably a lot of details there. We can. I know we've got a lot to cover, so I'm going to turn it over to Aaliyah and let her take it from here.
All right, we're going to give Steve's voice a rest for just a few minutes here. So some of this we've already covered, but I think it's probably appropriate just to just focus on it for a moment. So as described, MUDs are political subdivisions, so these are governmental entities, heavily regulated. We do always like to say that because sometimes there's confusion about whether MUDs are governmental entities, whether they're just like HOAs, whether they're not, whether they're quasi-governmental entities. These are true political subdivisions of the state of Texas. Unlike a home rule city, where you can impose your rules unless the state says otherwise, MUDs have specific limited purposes. So unless the legislature gives them the power to do something, they can't do it. So in this case, MUDs have been given the ability to exercise powers granted by the state to do water, sewer, drainage, roads, parks, really core facilities. As mentioned in one of the earlier slides, they do also have the ability to engage in firefighting services if they have a fire plan, to pay for policing services, sometimes by contracting with the sheriff's office or a constable's office, and to provide trash service, which has become a pretty popular service item in many districts. This was discussed earlier, whether or not the public infrastructure built in a MUD would be subject to the city ordinances. What we would do is, if it's in the city, that's an easy yes. If it's in the ETJ, what we would do is, in the consent to the creation that the city would provide, you would require them to follow your requirements, and that would also be in the development agreement. The infrastructure is regulated by the TCEQ, so that's the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, the statewide agency. They are the oversight body, as discussed. MUDs are subject to the TCEQ feasibility rules, and so any lawyer who's used to working with MUDs pretty much always carries around the thick binder of TCEQ rules, which are the ins and outs of all of the rules that have to be followed to a T in order for the district to issue debt later and reimburse the developer for their upfront costs. The bonds that we've discussed, there is a process for MUD bond approval that goes through the TCEQ. And importantly, just like any governmental entity, there is approval by the Texas Attorney General's office before you can actually issue that debt. The MUDs, because they're governmental entities, comply with the Open Meetings Act and the Public Information Act. All of the ethics rules, that you all have to follow, they have to follow. And MUDs are also required to comply with public bidding requirements for the infrastructure that they are constructing. All right, so with respect to creation, there are two different ways to create a MUD. Most commonly, they're created through an application process with the TCEQ, but they can also be created directly by the Texas legislature. If the MUD is in a city's corporate limits or in its ETJ, the city is required to give its consent prior to the creation and also prior to the annexation of land. So if you do consent to the creation of a MUD in your ETJ, and later that landowner wanted to make that district bigger, they would need to come back to the city to get approval to annex more land into the district. So one of the things that we've talked about quite a bit, and we'll keep talking about, is kind of this suite of agreements that would go along with the creation of a district, that in connection with the city granting its consent, typically the landowner and the city would negotiate terms, everything surrounding providing services. You would typically see a development agreement, you would see a utility agreement, and importantly, you would see that strategic partnership agreement as well. There are limited circumstances where MUDs can be created without a city consent. We don't usually recommend that. Y'all have to be neighbors for a long time. So normally we like to see a good amicable process work through. MUDs have the authority to add both contiguous and non-contiguous tracts of land. So you do sometimes see districts that are created over land that is not totally connected to one another. That can occur. And if the MUD is located out of the city in the county can have the right to review and provide recommendation to the TCEQ regarding creation of the MUD. But just a note there, the county doesn't have to provide consent. It's more of a review and recommendation, not a consent requirement. All right. With respect to governance and operation, so when a MUD is created, the MUD is governed by a 5-member board. So just like yourselves, you're going to have 5 folks who are on that governing board. Initially, they're appointed by the TCEQ, or they might be named in the legislation if it's created by the legislature. And later, once you have residents who live there and not just cows, right? You're going to have folks who are elected by the community to represent the community on that board. All of those elections are required to be conducted in accordance with the election code. So all of the same kind of requirements that you encounter in the elections that you hold, they would have to follow those as well. The board, their obligation is to move forward with developing facilities in the manner that's going to be in the best interest of the residents and the landowner. And MUDs typically don't have employees or staff. Typically, they utilize a number of professional consultants to carry those various roles and to advise the board so that they can take action. And they form kind of sort of something that acts like a staff, but really they're there to support the governing body. So the board of directors is the policy-making governing body. The board works with its consultants to implement those policy decisions. All right, this is one slide that I want to take a little more time on, and that's what is the role of the developer in the MUD. So the developer is the one that starts the process, right? You heard Floyd describe how we're here because you're getting asks like this. You're getting developers coming forward and saying, we want to build a community. We want to talk about what our options are. It's the developer who has that property, let's call it a 500-acre tract where they want to build single-family homes, that is going to be the one that requests the creation of the MUD. It comes from the landowner, all right? And also the developer is driving the need and the pacing for when they will need water, sewer, drainage, all of those kinds of facilities, when they'll need roads, and that's really based on their land plan and their development schedule. One thing that's really, really effective with MUDs is that this is a true public-private partnership, right? You have the developer, which is the private side. You have the district, which is the governmental entity, and they are partnering together. They will have a reimbursement agreement together where the developer pays all of the upfront costs. They are advancing all of the costs to build water lines, sewer lines, drainage ditches, roads, they are fronting all of those costs. And as Steve mentioned, what that does is it puts all of the risk associated with those costs on the land developer. All right, so they are the ones bearing that risk as opposed to the governmental entity. But this relationship has two sides, right? So they are advancing these funds. They're loaning the money, in effect, to the MUD as it's getting going. But once the developer delivers, once they've not only put in that public infrastructure, but also made sure that there's housing, structures above ground that are taxable, they've actually built taxable value, then the relationship shifts and the district has to pay them back. So this is a very important document, and it really makes it so that the developer is having to deliver on their end of the bargain before the district pays them back. And then once they do, then the district has that obligation. One thing to note, though, is that the rate at which they're getting paid back is really tied to those TCQ rules. The TCQ rules are going to make sure that the payments back to the developer are not putting the district out over their skis, right? They're not over leveraging. All right. So in the TCQ rules, typically it's a 10-to-1. So if the developer puts $10 million worth of taxable value in the district, then $1 million worth of bonds can be issued. And so as the taxable value grows, so then can the reimbursements back to them grow. But it makes sure that the district is not over leveraging, and those are the state requirements. And as a result, districts have an extremely steady, reliable credit. In the bond market, folks want to buy Texas MUD bonds because there's a zero default rate, and that is really extremely reliable. The other thing I'll note is that reimbursements may be limited in the event that the developer doesn't follow all of the TCQ details. So we talked about all of those rules. If the construction contracts aren't awarded in the right way, if they're not following all of the TCQ rules exactly, then that's going to impact what the developer can get back. So there's good accountability on that front. Speed up. All right, I'll go faster. Okay. So this. Yeah.
It's a lot.
All right.
I think we're keeping up.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Mayor. Well, so I won't go into detail here because I know you have this in front of you, but this just lists the types of consultants that will typically be hired by a MUD. Of course, the attorney, auditor, bookkeeper, engineer, financial advisor, a tax assessor collector, and an operator if they're operating water and sewer facilities. Yes. Did I skip that slide?
I got it. There you go.
Hold on.
You got it.
Thank you. That's actually back to you.
Oh,
Yeah.
all right. I'm going to pick it up here. So districts typically levy two components of tax rate, a debt service tax rate and an operations and maintenance tax rate. Typically about 90% of that tax rate is dedicated to debt service. So you are primarily financing public infrastructure, and most of the services that are provided, if there's a fee-for-services agreement, are done on a fee basis. So they're typically added on a water bill on a monthly fee basis. The districts have the authority to levy that ad valorem tax each year. That tax applies as of January 1, just like your property tax. By operation of law, we sell what are called unlimited tax bonds, meaning we are pledging to the bondholders that we're going to levy whatever tax is necessary to make sure the bonds don't default. However, we're subject to the TCQ feasibility rules, so we're not permitted to sell them if we can't sell them at a reasonable tax rate. That tax rate varies throughout the state. Here in Amarillo, the counties that surround you are all what are called $1 counties. You could not exceed, on a feasibility basis, $1 per $100 of assessed value, or 1%. And as Aaliyah mentioned, these, what that tax rate is determined by each district, and we have to submit applications to the TCEQ based upon the value that we have on the ground to prove that we can feasibly sell the bonds within that tax rate. Let's see, the MUD and the developer enter into a reimbursement agreement early on. We sell, as Leah mentioned, typically the early on, keeping that debt to assessed value below 10%, in order that the developer does not over leverage the district. Those agreements have to be entered into prior to the construction of all that public infrastructure. We sell bonds very similar to the way that the city does in process. The big exception is all of our bonds are sold on a competitive basis into the open market. We do not have negotiated sales. And so those bonds are typically early on sold non-rated, non-insured, and mostly are purchased by Texans. Once we have an underlying credit rating or municipal bond insurance, Wall Street's in play. That typically is our second or third bond issue in most districts. But there is an enormous appetite today. Our typical district right now is selling in the low 4% range, just to give you an idea. Let's see. But obviously we submit a huge application to the TCEQ asking permission to sell bonds. Then we do offering documents similar to y'all's offering documents when you sell bonds, and then go into the market with a competitive sale. Attorney General has to, in addition, approve those. And last but not least, we have to do an agreed upon procedures review or audit by an independent CPA to confirm that all the costs that were included and paid for were for the benefit of the district, and that basically complied with the TCEQ rules. Let me stop right here because I want to kind of slow down and talk a little bit about what the options are right now for a developer who has land in your ETJ, because it really falls into three categories, and this is really kind of the meat of where we are. If we proceeded with the request of the developer, we would the city would be asked to consent to the creation of a district that would be allowed to develop in your ETJ. Y'all would agree on all of the design standards, what ordinances apply, et cetera. You would agree to provide utilities at their cost. You would decide which services to provide. And as we mentioned, enter into a strategic partnership agreement that allows you the right, but not the obligation, to annex them at a time in the future. That's option one. Option two is for them to do what has traditionally been done, and that is they can annex in. And obviously, if they annex in, your immediate duty is to provide full municipal services, to extend utilities. You don't have an impact fee. You have to provide police and fire by state law. And so if you really did an analysis of that, that is a very expensive proposition because those limited growth of rooftops at the projected values here simply don't support either the services or the extension of those utilities. There is a third option under state law for the developer, and that is called the ETJ opt-out. And the ETJ opt-out under Senate Bill 2038 of the 23 legislative session gives the developer the right to submit a petition to the city that is non-discretionary, that in 45 days they are no longer in your city's ETJ. That option in an area like this will really be determined whether it's viable depending on the availability of water. Because if you can't solve for water, an ETJ opt-out is meaningless. And so I don't know the answer to that, whether there's a viable option. That's probably others can answer that question. But if they did opt out, they would be in the county, and they would only be subject to county regulation. And obviously, county regulation is very limited. They don't have land use control. They don't have lot size control. They don't have the ability to issue an obligation for building permits and inspections, et cetera, some limited fire controls, et cetera. And so that would take you down a very different path, particularly because you would not have that strategic partnership agreement. And once it develops, you wouldn't be able to ever annex that area without holding an election. And so it creates a bit of a fork in the road, to be honest with you, because if you desire to grow in that direction and it does develop pursuant to an ETJ opt-out, absent passing that election by the residents in the area who wouldn't at the time be paying a city property tax, which is a very difficult thing, that area would never become part of the city. Now, big part of that is, can they solve for water? And obviously they'd have to solve for sewer also, there. What we believe, and what we have begun putting together as far as an outline or thought process here, is that from a financial standpoint, that the city can have the developer with a MUD in the ETJ isolate where that new growth pays for itself. You can negotiate the terms and conditions of a development agreement that, because you have bought a seat at the table, you have the water, you have the sewer, you can have where you're not subsidizing services, either water and sewer service, police, fire, trash. They can pay for those items, and then you have the right to eventually full purpose annex those areas. That path is actually a request that you have received from the developer. Probably, what's to be negotiated is what's in that development agreement, what fees for services, what, are you going to provide wholesale service, retail service, et cetera. But the general concept is who's going to pay for this growth. As you know, infrastructure has gotten extraordinarily expensive, and the ability to continue to meet all the demands that you have from a water side, sewer side, drainage side is a very expensive proposition on a full-purpose annexed standpoint. The other decision that we need and thought process we need from y'all is what do you really want to maintain in the future? Because when you annex, obviously everything would be isolated before you annex, but when you annex, the city is used to paying for water and sewer and roads because you'll take those and you'll have revenues and property tax revenues. The real question is, beyond that, how are the things going to be maintained for drainage to make sure that on a long-term basis this continues to look the way that it looks when they build it initially? And thinking through the long-term for maintenance, I think, is also critically important here, particularly when it relates to any public parks, because what we see is a developer can come in, build beautiful parks, but every piece of playground equipment that they build, in 15 years is not going to comply with the current standards. There's going to be, big capital costs, drainage. You may have, failures, repairs, et cetera. So one of the things that we see a lot around the state is providing on a long-term basis for those to occur either through the districts or through a combination with a public improvement district that just assesses for those items. And really, again, this is about are those new costs going to be on the city's ledger or on the new growth's ledger for maintenance? And so you do have the ability to combine this district with a maintenance public improvement district that would maintain the parks and rec and maintain the drainage, assuming y'all decided that when you annex you wanted to take maintenance of the roads and ownership of those and maintenance of all the water and sewer facilities. And so one of our proposals that we're looking for feedback on is, do you want to include as part of this a way to create some certainty from day one about how that maintenance will occur even after the annexation occurs? And certainly a public improvement district could be a mechanism to do that. There are some other ways to do that. We've had some limited discussion with the other side, and they would probably prefer this route. But we're open to talking about that long-term maintenance because, what we want is to create a structure that not only makes this financially viable for the city initially, financially viable for the developer initially, but really on a long-term basis, in order to maintain property values, you need to structurally put in place the mechanisms to make sure that this community in 30 years can maintain its property values, and that's generally how's it maintained. Do the parks still look great? Is the grass getting mowed in the drainage? Did they replace the playground equipment? All of those things, and I think planning for those ends up creating a lot more stability in your tax base if they're appropriately planned for. With that, I'll stop talking.
I just want to add to that. That's a good point. Currently, our PID policy in this development manual does not provide for this type of maintenance. Our PID policy is strictly for amenities and park-type amenities. So that path would require some adjustment to the PID policy as well. Now, Steve, I would ask you to clarify just briefly that the traditional annexation with a PID improvement also is an option. You touched on that, but clarify that just a little, that it doesn't quite get to where mud is on all of these things, but it is an option that the traditional annexation with a PID policy change for reimbursement is an option.
Yeah. So one option, in addition to full purpose annexation, would be to overlay it with a PID. What you do there is you're layering, you're going to pay the city property tax, and the PID assessment would be on top of that. And so you have part of the problem, and why I think you would meet with some resistance, is in order to create an equivalent financing vehicle, you would need a PID assessment equal to a $1 PID assessment to be able to have identical financing capability. Now, part of that could be offset by by the city paying for more things because you annexed it. But on an equivalent basis, you would, in the market, have a project that would have both your tax rate plus the PID assessment on top of it. I think that would be a very difficult thing for the developer to create a marketable project that is competitive with the ETJ mud. I'm not saying that they couldn't do a lesser PID and put more cost into the lot prices. But obviously a big part of this is trying to pull those infrastructure costs out of the PID. So the second is the PID from a financing standpoint is an assessment-based vehicle. It's a far less efficient financing vehicle. Reserve funds, higher interest rates, et cetera. So if you're going to use an in-city vehicle, we would tell you that it's far more efficient to create an in-city MUD overlaying a full-purpose annex tract than an in-city PID, because the same dollar doesn't go nearly as far in a PID as it does in an in-city MUD. Having said that, I think you would find that the developer would say it's really difficult for them to apply a full, fully loaded equivalent financing in a PID in city, because they have to pay the city tax rate also. If that makes sense.
You may have already touched on it. Is there a boundary to, is it strictly MUDs allowed in the ETJ, or is there a boundary that it can go outside the ETJ as well?
It can go into the county in the ETJ. Obviously, you have to get the city's consent if it's in the ETJ or in the corporate limits. And you would probably in the documents say they can't add additional land in the county to a ETJ or in-city MUD without the consent of the city. And so, yes, they can extend outside, but it would be with your consent.
And maybe, Councilmember, if I could just add, there was discussion earlier about Senate Bill 2038, the ETJ opt-out. If you do have a landowner in your ETJ that chooses to opt out, they can then create a MUD over that, totally outside of the city's ETJ. The downside for the city, of course, is that they're not following any of your requirements. And probably the downside for them is that they may not have an opportunity to find water outside of working with the city.
So I guess a better question would be is, if there's a developer that wants to do something outside of our current ETJ with
Yes.
the MUD, I mean, that's completely...
There's no consent requirement, no approvals by the city. The county does have the right to comment to the TCEQ about any concerns. But yes, whether it's by opt-out or it today is physically in the county only, they can go straight to either the legislature or the TCEQ to create that district.
Okay, thank you.
But that, in that scenario, that would restrict annexation, correct?
It would.
Because it's not adjacent.
That's correct. Now, if part of what I would suggest is if they can't solve for water and you can, you probably would want them to voluntarily, enter into an agreement with you, petition to come into your ETJ, have a strategic partnership agreement, and really, that the ability to solve for water creates your leverage.
Okay.
So I wanted to comment there. So the 2002 resolution for city services outside the city require voluntary annexation to get services for water and sewer. So that would be triggered for any of these hypotheticals. Okay. So just so you know that when he's saying solve for water and sewer, we're going to land on existing policy that's in place, the 2002 resolution that says it requires a voluntary annexation, which leads right back into what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Okay. So what is the district's board interaction like with council or staff? Like, how does that?
It really varies from kind of completely standalone, other than compliance with the agreements, to negotiating in the agreements, a lot of coordination. And so that's really a decision for y'all to make. I think in our term sheet we've talked about having meetings at the city, because that way your staff can sit in and listen to the meetings and know what are going on. There's a long list of things that they're obligated to provide the public from a transparency standpoint, budgets, audits, all of those things. but there's certainly opportunities to coordinate. And really, I think structurally, it's very helpful on the front end to think through those things. We want to have an annual, infrastructure meeting where we know their 3-year projections on build out, their water demands, their sewer demands. We want to have periodic, coordination meetings, and so we often build those into our agreements. But the best thing is really communication. And I would say it's more often, just being honest with you, the city's lack of participation in the district. And so part of why we would say meeting here makes a lot of sense is you're then going to open that line of communication. You're going to know what they're doing. And have your staff there to understand. And I think those things can be very, very helpful. The biggest thing is communication, frankly.
So council can define that basically
Absolutely.
on the front end.
We would expect, and actually we've already, in our proposed term sheet, put some of those things in there in coordination with your staff.
I'm curious in the overlap because Councilman brings up a really good point. So with our PIDs, we're the fiscal agent to help with the PID, function, and so we gain a lot there. Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah.
Fiscal agent,
Good.
Mrs. Stores?
Yeah, well,
I'm curious if you had a MUD, would you be able to offer some of those same services that maybe that MUD entity would benefit from, the streamline of it? Plus, then we have a little bit more of our checks and balances, and it would be an annualized, you'd be on kind of the list of reporting, we would know how things were going.
Yeah.
And as far as strategic planning and development, we would know a little bit more easily, like what those amenities are growing
Right.
into. Do you have board members that are meeting saying, well, we want
Sure.
a water park?
Yeah, so the big difference is PID is not a separate governmental entity. It is a component unit of the city. And so y'all are, in fact, the fiscal, y'all, it is the.
So you don't have that opportunity with a MUD.
With the MUD, those board members' fiduciary duty
Okay.
is to their governmental entity, similar to yours. So they could not delegate. Coordinate is very different. I would greatly encourage communication and coordination. Delegation of any of those powers would not be permissible.
Okay. So it still functions the same in a strategic growth or strategic
Correct.
planning element, but then just the fiscal agent side or the not needed.
Yeah,
Because
and-
they're a
and-
taxing entity.
Yeah, and certainly, submission of, their whenever they do bond applications, they're going to submit that bond application to you so you know what they're doing. Looking at all of those, what they're doing from a financing standpoint. But what I would say is if staff is there, participating in these, none of that will be a surprise. It will all be just an ordinary course of business. And that's what we really want to set up.
Could you go back to and talk to just briefly on the benefit for the borrowing capabilities for the actual independent owner?
Yeah.
So are you saying that within a MUD, you have an opportunity to apply as a individual homeowner for a lower interest rate loan because you're inside of that MUD?
No. Typically, what we're seeing is we're pulling out of the mortgage the public infrastructure cost, and so instead of all of the public infrastructure being embedded in your mortgage, you're paying a property tax for that component, and so thereby lowering. There are a lot more people that can afford a $350,000 mortgage than a $450,000 mortgage. We're pulling that out. The other is that obviously what we are borrowing is on the basis of the issuance of tax-exempt debt. And if you looked at the comparable rates right now, let's just say a mortgage typically right now is 7%, maybe it's slightly under 7%. We're borrowing in our MUD at 4.25%. So that same, $75,000 to $100,000 per lot in the MUD is being financed at 4.5. It was in your mortgage, it would be at 7.
And where you're arriving at that is in the cost of development for the lot. So instead of selling a $100,000 lot, you're selling a $50,000 lot.
That's great.
Because
You're
you
able-
finance that $50,000 difference within the total cost of the MUD, and it sits as a standalone that's being serviced with a tax rate.
That's correct. That's
Okay.
exactly right.
What, great question, right? Like, what keeps a developer from not profiting an extra $10,000 and you wouldn't know that he's selling the lot at 60 instead of 50, and now you've paid for it?
Yeah, so
Well said.
the developer, obviously, you're in a very, you're competitive market. I mean, the biggest problem for our developers today statewide is affordability. And so with land cost, infrastructure cost, and interest rates, they are trying to deliver homes as inexpensively as they can. And so I am not telling you that all of that cost automatically gets pulled out.
Mm-hmm.
Some of it may be allocated to a higher amenity package. Some of it may be allocated to less density than they would otherwise provide. But really the market drives that price, and everybody is trying to get more people to be able to afford the houses, because we've priced everybody out of the market, large. I'll just give you a North Texas, Dallas, Fort Worth. In 2013, the affordability index was 83%, which means a couple of median income could afford 83% of the new housing stock. That today is at 27%. So only a couple of median income can only afford 27% of the housing stock. So, it is an incredible effort to try to deliver those houses as efficiently as possible, because you've taken so many purchasers out of the market. And I mean, be honest, a lot of Americans can't afford a house. The average, I saw the other day, the average first-time home buyer now is 39 years old. It's really sad.
And just to add some additional comfort to this issue of, what's to stop the developer from just getting this, windfall that no one notices, I'll just note that on the MUD reimbursement, so when the MUD issues bonds to pay the developer back, there is this very detailed rule process that you're having to follow so that they get back what they paid, right? That they're getting paid the actual costs of that competitively bid public infrastructure. And then you have the third-party independent accountant that the auditor that the district hires to go through literally every single check and payment that is made by the developer and make sure that they're only getting paid back what they are owed without any kind of windfall to that.
You can't add any cost for anything
So
other than water, sewer, drainage, and roads that you built.
There is a way to cap the building construction costs. So at a certain point in time, the development is considered complete. Costs are input. Bond has been issued for reimbursements, which they want that.
Right.
Now you have a total amount that is bonded and won't be added to, or they could come back and add additional amenities per their 5-member board.
Yeah. Here, we're only doing water, sewer, drainage, and roads, and so once they get through all of those, they will sell the bonds for those. If you then decide then or 5 years later to annex, all of those facilities are brand new. Your curb and gutter streets, for 20 years, you're not going to need to do much maintenance or repair and replacement. And just so you know, all of those end up with your city required, maintenance bonds, et cetera. If you were to decide not to annex, and you're sitting in year 30 or 40 and their water lines start breaking, yeah, they're going to sell more bonds so they can continue to provide service. But they don't, there's no incentive. And really, probably the real key there is the board members at that time are all the taxpayers. They're not going to want to pay a single dollar more in taxes than for the actual infrastructure that's serving them.
Okay, so that makes sense. So really, these policies are driven on like free market capitalism. So it's just going to be the affordability of the lot, being able to combine these dollars, both bond, lower interest funded versus, I guess, the cost of the house. Right, well, the cost of the house. So, I mean, I definitely see that this gives us a way for growth to pay for growth. I actually believe that growth actually pays for growth and some replacement. I don't see it the other way. I don't think existing taxes pay for growth. But in the way in which if I was to bring something to council and say we should go and spend $30 million in this future development, hoping that the developer puts in $70 million and 10 years from now there's 3,000 units. Then I could justify that as, well, existing tax rate and taxpayer are paying for growth.
Yeah.
This way it flips it around where it isolates it. I love that. I think the question, the concern is what happens to that tax rate when they're different and we're trying to annex with so let's say our tax rate's 45 cents.
Yeah.
And their tax rate is 90 cents. So are we annexing that property in at a discount for that property owner and they get to realize that savings as soon as they come into the city, or tell us about the variance and how that would work?
So what we typically see is those tax rates are at the highest that they're going to be from day one, and then they begin to slide down. And, actually from the city's perspective, you want them to amortize as much debt on their own tax rate to pay it off as quickly as they can. But you will see as development progresses, that tax rate will start sliding down. Typically what we see cities do is they'll start analyzing the math on whether it's taking into account converting from being wholesale water to retail water. Do you pick up some additional revenue there? Converting, looking at how much sales tax is really being generated from all of those new rooftops. But more importantly, where is their tax rate, and when are you ready to annex and bring it into the city for full purposes? And that's a decision that a future council will make, but it is not an obligation. So it is a right. Now you'll see, most cities other than City of Houston, if you look at them, out in year, after they've paid off the debt, depending on how long their development cycle is, they're gonna watch that tax rate and eventually then full purpose annex it into the city, pursuant to the SBA.
In terms of like SB2 with our 3.5% growth restrictions, if I were to annex a sizable MUD, do I get to absorb the revenue they're bringing in, or am I now, because it's typically I'm 3.5%.
Yeah.
So if I suddenly bring in all that tax base,
Right.
am I still limited to 3.5%, or do I get to absorb what they're bringing in in order to incorporate what they need for their side of things?
Yeah, we may have to give you a more technical answer, but I believe that's captured in that the growth component of that. But let us give you a more definitive answer.
I seem to recall there being a calculation to that, and I don't remember, Laura, if you remember, but I've never encountered it yet. I hope there is an allowance for that. Otherwise,
Yes.
otherwise I won't be able to keep up with their costs at all.
That's a fair question. We will get you a more definitive answer.
So we see that there are some concerns in the logistics and the transition. At some point,
Right.
these things intersect. So they have a dollar rate, let's say that you could afford that. We have a 40-cent rate. At some point, we're going to hit that 40-cent rate. We want to annex at that point. They've gotten their reimbursements back.
Correct.
And they kept their lot price down. So ideally, they're selling lots for $30,000 where everybody else around town selling them for $60,000. The issue is they finance the other 50% of that lot, so that owner is still making the same $2,000 a month payment that they would have, but they took advantage of the finance mechanism.
That's correct.
And then the water, is it too early to talk about this? Do we want to come back at another time and just let this kind of set in for what we're looking at?
I think specifics, we're going to have different levels of discussions, but getting direction from you today for us to understand that. But when you look at a MUD from the options from a long-term perspective, you're looking at, you've got to look around the city at all the options of MUDs and what that would look like. And so staff's recommendation is that you almost have to maintain the capacity as a wholesale provider, because a retail provider outside the city limits has a whole set of challenges related to that. And I know you're probably going into more detail, but then there are considerations of how to access water. Annexation provides a benefit of access to that water and wastewater. So what does that look like in relation to a MUD? Are we granting something that this area and these houses will have permanent access to, water rights, sewer plants, the existing infrastructure that's out there? That all has to be in that individual negotiation with each developer, and that would come into an executive session discussion after we go through that process. So I think that's where you're headed, Mayor, is into those details, and that's something that I think they're going to have to negotiate and bring to you for a discussion as terms and conditions of an agreement.
I think that's a really good answer, because what I'm looking for is if we could give you a direction on, do we want a template or do we not? Yeah. So we could say, you know what, not worth it for us. Let's just let everything happen the way it happens. And that has kind of been somewhat of, we just tell you we don't have any money and you go figure it out.
Right.
If we as a council decide, no, we would like to strategically work alongside of our developing community, then what we are looking for, if council moves in this, what I would try to direct is, let's get a basic template, a basic model that speaks to the uniformity of the things that don't come to exec. No, in every MUD, this is what's fair. In every MUD, these are the requirements. Bare minimum, if we don't have these things, then you're not a MUD. You're not operating according to state law requirements, or you're not going to fit up next to what we would have to annex. So you list those minimums. Then from there, we would like staff's recommendations. And I'm going to put out a number. I don't know what it is, but let's say it's 120% water. Instead of 100%. Like so, water user inside city limits pays $1, outside city limits pays $1.20. Well, the amount that we would put on there for staff's recommendation would be a negotiable, and so that could function differently depending on are we doing a MUD for 500 homes, or are we doing a MUD for 5,000 homes? Right. And what does market allow for at the time? So the ability to continue to grow based on the change of how things happen in the construction industry and the demand. Council, I want to stop there and ask you guys, is this something, all options are on the table for developers at this point. The state has seen to it that they could petition and they can opt out of your ETJ, which we are also contiguous, so we can't leap out 5 miles and annex any longer anyway. So you're pretty confined. So your developer and your private property rights trump what you're going to mandate. Do we see the benefit in moving forward with something that we could provide as a template and a model that we want these consultants to bring back to us? Or would you rather just sit and wait and let staff negotiate with the developer that's at hand and just see if that process brings something that sets a precedent that we can live with? Really, we don't have any negotiating power in that. Staff kind of has to negotiate it, but you still have the ability to tweak independently with staff once they bring it back. It's just the exchange back and forth during the meantime. So maybe 3 options there, and would just ask council to speak to those.
I think the template idea is good. I think that'd be a good starting point.
Yeah, I would agree. Do we have a specific builder or development that's inquired about this?
Yes, we've had one actually submit an application to the TCEQ, and we've had another major developer looking at submitting.
Okay. Yeah. No, I think that's a good idea. Look at the template. I think it's a tool that
Okay.
we could definitely use.
This side? Any drawback on putting a template out? Are we gonna regret kind of having a basis? I don't see the issue. I guess that's a question for our consultants. Have you seen historically somebody try to work off of like a precedent, and they're getting hung up because things are so different? One side of town's flat, the other side of town is rolling hills. And so how does that work?
Well, there typically 2 ways. One is you go through one of these processes, learn what the issues are, and then after you have gone through a live one, you say, okay, now we understand it. We understand where all the push points are. We understand, kind of talking with staff, what our issues are, and then you produce a policy for guidance going forward, and you've kind of learned from that first one in order to create the policy. The other is to spend the time kind of creating the policy on the front end, and maybe a template agreement, et cetera. And I think those things are a little bit harder in a vacuum because there's nothing like a real project to actually the other side discussing issues that creates a learning experience about what's important to you. But I think it can be done either way. I think I don't think there are enough different issues around town that there needs to be different. There could be slightly different issues and different pressure planes or whatever, but not enough that there needs to be different policies for different parts of town.
So just a little bit of a directive. It'd be very helpful for council because we're learning.
Yeah.
And we don't have this. There's no reference point. So we can't even look best practices like around here, right? You're going to have to pick something that's probably pretty different from who we are. Could you give us a template and kind of the minimum requirements of your recommendation, and could you separate out staff's recommendations? That way we could see kind of what's coming from our local.
Got it.
Here's the history. This is where we know we need to land.
Yeah.
Because we're paying those bills versus maybe your advisement.
Yeah.
And then how long would it take you guys to get back in front of this council?
I think we can probably turn this around in a week or so, and then let staff have some time to take a look at it, and then.
So if we were looking January, like let's say we have the holidays and we need it to go back and forth, I would assume you would have something city manager, assistants, and deputy would need to consult and then go back and forth. So we don't need something that we're ready to vote on.
Right.
We need something we can take the next step with you
Got
on.
it.
And then does this help you with your negotiations with said developers? Or are they far enough along ahead that could be coming prior to us getting this from you?
Yeah, I think they're pretty far along in their thought process. And so I think with some feedback on a limited number of issues, one is this overall structure of ETJ, SPA, et cetera, the direction. How do you want to deal with maintenance? Which public services are you interested in continuing to provide? Do you want to provide for a maintenance pit on an ongoing basis? I think with that limited number of feedbacks on those questions, we could be drafting an agreement.
Okay, so you might be able to bring us back the bones with a few things that we would attach to it.
Correct.
And then we'd be able to say, maintenance PID looks
Yeah.
good, or not needed, let's not keep it in the basic package. We know about it,
Yeah.
could be an add-on if needed. So I think that if we could get something back through staff, where if staff was comfortable and they could feed it and disseminate it to council in December,
Okay.
then maybe we could even have a discussion, without you guys if we needed to.
Sure.
At a council meeting, we're going to have one in December. But if we miss that, then we would be looking at council in January or another work session if needed.
Yeah.
But really would engage with y'all in that and see if we can move it forward. Full well knowing like we may have something we take a step back from.
So for clarification, should we continue to negotiate with the existing one?
I would say so. I don't think you're going to bring me something to vote on in December, correct?
I can't speak to that. I don't know where the process is at.
Well, I would just say, I think that, I think the process of going through this term sheet negotiation is really helping inform what will be the template, because it's that real-world experience of understanding what the issues are. And so I think these are kind of running on parallel paths. But I'm not hearing anything today from council that is inconsistent with the direction that we're going on in the term sheet in terms of principles.
Good.
Yeah, I feel like from what I've read in the MUD term sheet, I think much of what we've already negotiated would fit a template already. So I think we are, because MUDs are rather boxed, there's not a lot of creativity with these things. They're pretty much what they are. I think what we're doing now with this current developer is going to eventually just drive towards our template, I think. So
I would like to say that we would set a good expectation, have something in council's hands to read, study, and understand in December with a meeting in January.
Perfect.
And then that gives us all time to work through it. And I don't believe that would be a hindrance to our developer. I think he's been in negotiations for some time so far. So progress is good. Anything from staff or our consulting group here that they need to add before we try to feed everyone lunch?
No, Mayor, I'm good. Steve, for you
I mean, the main thing is really everything falls from this whole concept of self-supporting, because that's really going to be the direction that you're giving staff when they're calculating, what payments need to be made. And I think if that's the approach, isolating, self-supporting, I think we're heading down the path to make it.
Well, we certainly, I know they're just getting to meet you. I've spent some time just on a phone call and then also looking and fielding questions back and forth. And then I've been looking at this for over a year. So I like this direction, and we like who's on our team.
Yeah.
We think you guys are very experienced and that this isn't a brand-new thing. I think when I first heard about it, but, what is it, 25, 30 years now?
At least.
Or more. And so we're on good footing,
Right.
and I think it's a good pathway, and we want all options to grow.
Super.
We're a very pro-growth council
Good.
and appreciate all growth and stimulus.
Super.
So it all starts with those rooftops.
Yeah.
We appreciate you guys being here with us. If anybody has anything they'd like to add, we can jump in. Otherwise, we're going to adjourn.
Thank y'all.
Good. Thank y'all.
Our
Okay.
pleasure.
We're adjourned. Miss Stephanie, you want to direct?
We've got lunch right back here.
Oh,
around the
great.
corner. And Aaliyah and Steve, y'all are welcome to join us if you want to. We've got some sandwiches and things from Jason's Deli back there. OEI is going